big election signs everywhere as all the parties mount an aggressive propaganda war against each other. Quebecers really seem to like this particular style of election sign. These big posters of the different politicians' faces tied to lamp posts. They're a lot more colorful and personal than the bland posters you tend to see in other parts of Canada. But of course, the giant faces also make them an inviting target for vandalism as well. But anyway, let's walk around a bit and see if we can find a poster for each of the main 5 political parties, and I'll tell you a bit about each one as we do. Okay, so here is one from the CAQ, which is the party that is currently in power in Quebec under Premier François Legault. The CAQ, or CAQ, is usually considered a fairly hardline nationalist populist party and the personal vehicle of Legault, who is one of the most unapologetically chauvinist leaders Quebec has had in a long time. His first term was defined by a number of aggressive initiatives designed to entrench the dominant position of French-Canadian culture in the province, including by imposing stricter legal requirements on shops, businesses, and hospitals to only use French, making an English language education harder to get, and banning Muslims and other religious minorities from wearing head coverings while interacting with the government.
It sparked anger, protests, and fear. Quebec's new French language protection law has divided the province.
Premier François Legault says strengthening Quebec's French language laws is a question of survival.
We are also proud to be a francophone nation in North America, and it's our duty to protect our common language.
Lots of reaction today to the Quebec government tabling its secularism bill.
The bill bans some public servants, such as teachers and police officers, from wearing religious symbols at work.
It's comparable to what we have in Germany, in Belgium, and in France.
He's taken a similarly hardline stance against immigration, calling it suicidal for French culture, and vowing to continue to cut it, as he already has. Though he's obviously pretty right-wing on this sort of cultural stuff, on economic issues, Legault has been more pragmatic and defensive towards Quebec's traditionally generous welfare state. He has been relatively progressive on climate stuff, and during COVID, he imposed some of the strictest lockdowns anywhere in North America, including a 5-month curfew where Quebecers weren't allowed to go out in public after 10 p.m. Premier Legault has enjoyed considerable popularity with the French-Canadian middle class in suburban and especially rural Quebec, where he is seen as a competent economic manager and a fierce protector of French culture. But as a disruptor of politics as usual in Quebec, he has also spawned a lot of critics on all sides, both from old guard nationalists and more liberal cosmopolitans, particularly in multicultural Montreal. This one here is from the Quebec Liberal Party, currently the second biggest party in the Quebec Parliament. The Liberal Party of Quebec is the oldest continuously operating party in the province and traces its roots back to the tradition of 19th century liberalism that produced Canada's other liberal parties. In more recent decades, however, the Quebec version of the party has evolved in very distinct ways that kind of make it its own thing. So, Quebec was a deeply traditionalist and very Catholic society well into the 20th century. In the 1960s, however, the province underwent a period of significant secularization and social reform known as the Quiet Revolution, which was heavily pushed by the province's reformist liberal premier of the time. During the 1960s and beyond, the Quebec Liberals accordingly became seen as the party of the province's educated urbanites, including business leaders and intellectuals, and just generally those with a more inclusive and modern vision of the province. Quebec's English-speaking minority, in particular, have long been considered very loyal Liberal supporters, as have immigrants. While provincial Liberal governments have supported the idea of some sort of special status for Quebec within the Canadian system, the party has always been very opposed to the idea of formal Quebec separatism. As Quebec separatism in turn rose as Quebec's dominant political debate in the late 20th century, the Liberals accordingly became increasingly defined as the party for anyone and everyone who opposed separatism, which could make them a kind of overbroad and unwieldy coalition at times. A good illustration of just how vast the Liberals' appeal had gotten by the early 2000s can be seen in the administration of Jean Charest. During the 1990s, Charest was the head of the National Conservative Party, but he joined the Quebec Liberals in 1998 to run for premier on an anti-separatist platform. And after he got elected, one of his cabinet ministers was a guy named Thomas Mulcair, who would later go on to be head of the National NDP. Nowhere else in Canadian politics would you ever expect a Conservative and an NDPer to consider themselves part of the same movement. But these days, the cause of Quebec separatism has greatly declined in popularity, and the Quebec Liberals are accordingly, once again, becoming primarily associated with a certain sort of urban cosmopolitanism, in contrast to Premier Legault's French supremacism. Their current leader is a woman named Dominique Anglade, a former corporate consultant and a child of Haitian immigrants, which I would say is a very Quebec Liberal Party kind of identity. And then we got the Parti Québécois, traditionally one of the two main political parties in Quebec, although not so much these days. So, as I mentioned, the late 20th century saw separatism dramatically rise in popularity as a political cause in Quebec. This idea that Quebec was so different from the rest of Canada, it needed to split off and form its own country. In 1968, the Parti Québécois was founded to be the primary political vehicle to achieve this goal, and it was repeatedly elected to power in the next few decades, though obviously it was never successful at actually achieving separatism. Like a reverse version of the Liberals, at its peak, the Parti Québécois was a pretty broad and sometimes unwieldy coalition of people who supported separatism. Premier Legault got his start working for a separatist administration, and would have been considered on the party's more right-wing, sort of ethno-nationalist side. But there was also a leftist faction as well, who conceptualized Quebec separatism in a more Marxist sort of way. You know, liberating the Quebec people from Canada's oppressive colonialist capitalist system. Regardless, as I said, voter interest in formal separatism has declined quite dramatically in recent decades, to the point where the once mighty Parti Québécois is now in danger of becoming a fringe party. People blame this decline on a number of factors, one of which being that formal separatism is just an extremely logistically complicated thing to do, Brexit, and the idea is that Quebecers are tired of having their politicians spend all of their time arguing about it.
Do we want the street and a referendum, or do you want jobs or the economy?
But as well, as men like Legault have proven, the Canadian system has also shown itself to be flexible enough to allow Quebec to pursue a great deal of culturally nationalist initiatives even without formal separatism. Legault himself has been famously coy about whether he still supports separatism or not. He just says that he sees no point in pursuing it as a matter of practical politics. The current head of the Parti Québécois is a guy known as PSPP, or Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon. He is a young and fairly unknown figure in contemporary Quebec politics, further reflecting his party's decline as a substantial force. Can he keep them from falling into total obscurity?
La souveraineté du Québec, elle est possible, mais surtout nécessaire.
This is Quebec Solidaire, a rising star party in Quebec politics over the last couple of years. If Premier Legault and the CAQ represent the rise of a sort of culturally rightist flavor of Quebec nationalism, then Quebec Solidaire represents the consolidation of a distinct far-left vision. Founded in 2006, Quebec Solidaire has sought to be a democratic socialist party in a sort of European style, and is probably the most left-wing mainstream party anywhere in Canada. They support expanding Quebec's already generous welfare system with stuff like free college, rent control, universal basic income, and much higher taxes on the wealthy. They are also notable for rejecting some of the more traditional conventions of Canadian politics for not being progressive enough. Rather than having a single hierarchical leader, they have two co-spokespeople, one of whom is always a woman, and their politicians refuse to publicly swear an oath of allegiance to the British monarch.
The party wants to table a bill to abolish the practice.
We think that MNAs elected by the Quebec people should, swear allegiance to these people, and we think it's an old and anti-democratic practice.
In Quebec's last two elections, the majority of their candidates have been female. Quebec Solidaire has risen from the fringe to become a much more dominant player in Quebec politics in recent years, particularly in urban districts and with young voters. In the 2018 election, they staged a major breakthrough and became the provincial parliament's third largest party, narrowly beating out the Parti Québécois. The party's current co-heads are Manon Massy a seasoned social justice activist in Quebec, known for her aggressively unpretentious style, and Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, a 32-year-old who became famous as a college student for leading an anti-tuition strike against Quebec's former Liberal government in